Last week, I was listening to a podcast on macroeconomy from the Swedish outlet Dagens Industri, which is kind of a liberal or conservative outlet, you would say. And they were talking about the next speaker. And they were saying that everything that they thought that they knew about fighting inflation has now been turned upside down. And that was due to the ideas of our next guest. And I'm sure there are many more economists who have been forced to reconsider what they thought they knew on this topic. And one could say, Professor Weber, that you have revolutionized the public discourse on inflation control with your research on sellers inflation and price regulation. So therefore, me and I think plenty of us, we are so delighted to have you here and to be able to listen to you. You are currently at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, so please give Professor Isabella Weber a warm hand.
Thanks so much for having me. I wish I could be there in person, and great you are. Okay. What a flattering introduction. It's, of course, very difficult to still live up to expectations like that. Let me nevertheless try to share some thoughts. The presentation is today about the basic question of how to fight inflation in an age of overlapping emergencies. And I want to talk about systemically significant prices, profits, and conflict. You might wonder what I mean when I talk about overlapping emergencies, or it might be entirely obvious. In any case, what I have in mind is that we are at a moment where indeed several emergencies have been overlapping. We have been living through the mega emergency of the global pandemic, the Russian war in Ukraine, and of course, the climate emergency is increasingly a reality. But we are also living in an age of increasingly unstable global political institutions, while at the same time, the economy is as deeply integrated as it probably has never been. So in that sense, I'm thinking about our current moment as a moment of overlapping emergencies. We do not know where the next shock will hit. We don't know when the next shock hit, but we can be pretty sure that there will be more bumps on the road. My talk will be based on two presentations that are joint work with my co-authors. The first one is titled Inflation in Times of Overlapping Emergencies, very much along the lines of what I just said, systemically significant prices from an input-output perspective. To use a metaphor, and I don't know if you know these kind of coin-powered horses in Sweden. I grew up in Germany, and they used to be in front of supermarkets. So to use a metaphor, we used to think about inflation very much in the spirit of a very predictable kind of process that is very much along one dimension, and where we know exactly what the mechanism is to keep the range of motion within a certain corridor. So in that sense, we used to think about inflation a little bit like the movement of this coin-powered horse. We know exactly how much to the front and how much to the back it can go, and it doesn't take a very high level of engineering to understand what the mechanism is that would control the movement of this horse. This horse is also not moving to the side, it's only moving in one dimension. There would have been some disagreement on whether the critical variable is the quantity of money in circulation in the economy, whether it's about the relationship between aggregate supply and aggregate demand, whether expectations play some role. But by and large, we would have looked at macroeconomic variables that determine the macro outcome of inflation. So from that perspective, inflation would have been considered as a purely macroeconomic phenomenon, both in terms of its origins and, of course, inflation defined as the change in the general price level is itself on the macro level. What I have been arguing, in fact, since late 2021, and at the time that was quite heretic indeed, but I feel by now it has become almost mainstream. When I look at the speeches at Jackson Hole, when I look at Lagarde's latest speech at Jackson Hole, when I look at the speech of the IMF chief economist, it seems like that way of thinking about inflation has really taken on. So what I have been arguing is to say that we have to think about inflation and price instabilities on the general price level in times of overlapping emergencies, more from the perspective of micro and sectoral shocks. So to use again a metaphor, it's more like riding an actual horse where you don't know what is going to trigger the horse. The horse can move in all sorts of different directions. But as any accomplished equestrian, or even just a beginner's equestrian will know, there are things that you can do to control the triggers of your horse. There are knowable triggers. For example, if you go on a trail ride and you encounter someone on a bicycle, it's a good idea for you to talk to that person so that your horse can recognize that person as a human being and doesn't take it for a steel monster. So by simply talking to that person, you can reduce the chance of your horse being triggered by the encounter with a cyclist. So there are things like this that are known possible triggers. We don't know when there will be a cyclist. We don't know where we might encounter a cyclist. But we know that when we do, it's a good idea to behave in that way. Similarly, in times of overlapping emergencies, as I said, there will be shocks. I think we can be fairly certain. And I think it would be a good idea for us to start thinking about which kind of shocks might matter most for overall price stability and what we might be able to do in terms of disaster preparedness, a form of economic disaster preparedness for these kind of shocks. If this is the case, we want to know which shocks matter. One way of approaching this is to use input-output techniques. Input-output techniques is a way to model the economy as an interconnected system, as a circular flow, where one sector's output is another sector's input. In that sense, one sector's prices are also another sector's costs, which allows us to model prices as the outcome of costs that preceded any one price. One of the first applications of input-output modeling was during the Second World War, when the Allied forces tried to understand with what kind of bombing they could create the largest possible destruction on the part of the enemy's economy. You can see here a newspaper clipping from a British newspaper. This was a German oil plant. What they found was that targeting oil plants would have would create huge collateral damages, because without oil, no movement of tanks, without oil, no production of weapons, without oil, no transportation, no logistics, and so on. So in other words, they were trying to understand what the systemically important points from the perspective of production would have been in the war economy of the enemy. We are using a similar kind of technique, but we use an input-output model not for outputs, but for prices, to try to tackle the following research question. If inflation is indeed not always and everywhere a macroeconomic phenomenon, as I have just suggested, but can be unleashed by micro shocks on the supply side, we need to identify which sectors present points of vulnerability for monetary stability, or in other words, have the greatest potential to become systemically significant or systemically important for inflation. So what we do in this paper is we construct the so-called Leontief price model, which, as I said, relates the output of one sector as a cost to the prices of another sector that uses that output as an input. We then simulate the inflation impact of price shocks, where these price shocks hit one sector at a time. So we do many simulations where each of these simulations is different in the sense that the shock hits a different sector in our 71 sector table for each of these simulations. We also calibrate these shocks in different ways. So we first use shocks that present the average price volatility before the COVID-19 pandemic. So the average degree of movement of prices as it happened during the so-called Great Moderation, where by and large, things were more stable in rich countries like the United States. We then use the price movements as they actually occurred in the COVID-19 pandemic. And for each of these shocks, we assume that there is a so-called full cost pass-through in the sense that when a sector experiences an increase in cost because the output of another sector has become more expensive, that sector that is using this output would be passing on this cost one-to-one. So if, let's say, a plastic producer uses $50 of oil for $150 of plastic, and the price of oil goes up to $75, then the price of plastic for the same unit would now be $175. We then rank all sectors by the inflation impact that we get from simulating these shocks. Each shock would have a direct inflation impact and an indirect inflation impact. The direct inflation impact is simply the increase in the CPI. If the, let's say, oil price goes up, the price at the pump goes up, and in the consumer basket, there would have been a direct effect of the increase in the price of oil. But there would also have been an indirect effect that comes from the increase in the price of plastic, where every plastic item in the consumer basket would now have become more expensive due to the increase in the price of oil. We call the inflation impact that we get from these average price movements latent systemically significant, in the sense like this is the potential ranking, this is the ranking of the potential inflation impact that could occur. And the second type, the realized systemically significant prices, in the sense that this is the ranking of which sectors actually matter in the COVID-19 inflation. This chart is designed for you to not be able to read it. I don't know what the situation is in your in the venue where you're all assembled, but I assume that you will have a hard time reading the labels. The point being that this is that I want you to simply focus on the shape of these rankings that we get from these simulations. And you can see that the bars, which each of these bars indicates the total inflation impact, composed of a yellow direct effect and a purple indirect effect, have very unequal length. So we can see that there's a top, a bracket of top ranks of 10 sectors or so that have a much larger inflation impact than all other sectors. On the left-hand side would be the latent systemically significant prices, and in the middle and to the right, the actually realized systemically important prices during the current inflation. If we now zoom in, you can see these green dots indicate the magnitude of the shock, and as I said, the bars indicate the inflation impact. When we look at the sectors that we would have identified as systemically important before the pandemic, then this is the set of sectors that would occupy the top ranks. They are petroleum and coal products, oil and gas extraction, farms, food and beverage and tobacco products, Federal Reserve banks, but we are not very convinced that banking is represented in an accurate way in these input-output tables. So I would suggest that we don't give too much emphasis to this within the method that we are using, which is, of course, not to say that banking is incredibly important for inflation. The next sector is chemical products, housing, utilities, and wholesale trade. If we now look at the shocks that are calibrated to the price movements in the fourth quarter of 2021, and you might remember that this was a time when inflation was just really taking off, we get basically the same set of sectors that really matter, with one exception, which is motor vehicles and parts dealers. And I guess everybody who has been following at least some business news knows, or has tried to buy a car, knows that the situation in the automotive sector has been very dramatic due to the chips shortages. If we move on to the second quarter of 2022, which is now, of course, the first quarter right at the onset of the Russian war in Ukraine, we find that, again, the same sectors matter. And by the way, all of these results are for the United States. Except that there's one more sector that shows up, which is the sector of truck transportation, which again was a sector that was very much affected by both the increase in gasoline prices, as well as by labor shortages and other kinds of bottlenecks in the transportation sector. If we think about what these sectors are that we have identified as systemically important, I think we can group them into three categories. The first one is basic necessities for human livelihoods. So housing, food, farms, utilities, and in the United States, unfortunately, also petroleum and gas products, because you can't get anywhere without a car in most parts of this country. Second, basic production inputs. Petroleum and gas products, again, which is both important for production as well as for livelihoods in the American automotive society. Oil and gas extraction and chemical products. So all of these are basic production inputs. And finally, basic circulation infrastructure, such as wholesale trade and also truck transportation. Now, with this, we have identified sectors that have the potential to matter most for inflation, but we have not made any statements on how these indirect inflation impacts actually come about. We have simply assumed that when costs go up, firms will start increasing their prices in ways that is basically just passing on costs. In a second paper, Sellers, Inflation, Profits, and Conflict, we now ask the question, why can large firms hike prices in an emergency? So in other words, why is it the case that firms can actually react to these cost shocks that come about in this input-output setting from these systemically important sectors in ways that actually end up increasing their prices? And as a matter of fact, what we have seen is that the corporate sector, by and large, has been not only able to protect themselves against rising costs, but has actually experienced spectacular increases in profit margins. So this is a chart here that goes back to 1947 and all the way to 2022. And you can see that both with and without adjustments, and I'm happy to comment on that in the Q&A if that's of interest, we have seen really an extreme spike in profit margins for non-financial corporations in 2021, right, with the reopening of the economy. And in fact, this spike has been so dramatic that if we look at the blue line without adjustments, we haven't seen profit margins as high as what we have been experiencing in 2021 and early 2022 since the aftermath of World War II, since the years 47 to 51. When we say sellers inflation, we are using a terminology that comes from Abba Lerner. And Abba Lerner pointed out in 1958, remember that chart that I just showed you, looking at the 1950s, that sellers-induced inflation simply means that inflation can also be driven by decisions of firms. So by and large, we assume that have been accustomed to assume that inflation is driven by increases in wages, which increases aggregate demand and thereby generates inflation. But Lerner insists that there is no essential asymmetry between the wage element and the profit element in the prices asked for the product, which means that there can also be an inflation that is driven by the pricing decisions of firms. We distinguish between commodity prices and prices for all other goods, in particular for sectors in which firms are actually price makers. In price-making settings, we argue that there are three basic principles of strategic pricing. The first one is that prices tend to be sticky, so firms tend to not lower prices, but they also don't tend to increase prices unless they can be certain that other firms are also increasing their prices. Secondly, for firms to be certain that their competitors are actually also increasing prices, there is, of course, a possibility of a cartel or established norms of price leadership, where whenever one specific firm increases prices, everybody follows. But what we argue is that sector-wide cost shocks can also function as such a coordinating mechanism that makes it safe for firms to increase their prices. Let me explain what I mean by that. If a plastic producer in normal times was to start increasing prices and didn't know whether their competitors would follow suit, they would be very careful in starting to increase such, to encourage such price increases. However, if we are in a situation of an enormous cost shock, and everybody knows that to protect profit margins, their competitors are likely to increase their costs, that fear of losing market share and losing customers when increasing prices vanishes. Thirdly, there can be situations where you have a huge asymmetry between demand and supply, which can be the case when you have bottlenecks, as we have been experiencing during the pandemic. And such bottlenecks can generate a form of temporary monopoly power for firms that are in command of inventories of the thing that has now become bottlenecked. So if we take this argument into to the question of how can we understand the dynamic of inflation, we are arguing that coming out of a situation of stability, there has first been an impulse, cost shocks that came from these most important sectors that I just showed to you. Then there is a propagation and amplification as firms react to these cost shocks by increasing their prices in ways that at least protect their profit margins. And if there are temporary monopolies, that actually increases profit margins. Now, one point that has been poorly understood is that if there is a cost shock and a firm keeps their profit margin constant, that actually means that the profit volume goes up. One way of thinking about this is if anyone who has ever bought a house and had to pay a brokerage fee, you probably would have thought about if you are paying more for your house, then the broker will actually get more for the same kind of transaction. So it's the same kind of effect that we are talking about here. And then at the third stage, we argue, labor eventually reacts to these price increases and tries to achieve a real wage catch-up in order to make good for the decline in living standards that came about from the onset of inflation. But these catch-up increases in wages are then an outcome of the impulse and the propagation and amplification stage and are not the origin of inflation. In the paper, we back up this argument with case studies of actual behavior of firms looking at earnings calls, where basically corporate leaders are telling us that what they are doing is protecting their profit margins or even enhancing their profit margins in the context of the shocks they have been experiencing. I'm gonna skip a little bit ahead in the interest of time. And jump right to this final slide. So if we think about inflation as a process that can be triggered by shocks to systemically important sectors. And these shocks are then propagated and amplified by the pricing behavior of firms. Then if we assume that we are living in overlapping emergencies and that more shocks are likely to come forward, then I think we want to start thinking about a form of disaster preparedness for these systemically important areas, so that when shocks hit these areas, we can absorb these shocks as much as possible locally, instead of getting all of these propagation effects, which then turn a local shock into a generalized inflation. And this kind of inflation is not only undesirable because it creates macroeconomic instability, but it's also undesirable because if it is the case that the corporate sector, by and large, can protect or even enhance their profit margins in response to these kind of shocks, this means that the outcome of this kind of inflation, at least up until stage 3, is a redistribution from everybody to the corporate sector, which in a context of already incredibly unequal societies and already a looming inequality crisis, I think, and in the context of the rise of extreme right-wing parties, is an extremely also politically and socially dangerous kind of thing to deal with. So how could a local shock absorber look like? If you take the example of oil and gas, it could, for example, be a strategic buffer stock, pretty much like what the United States already has in terms of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. But these kind of buffer stocks would need to be larger and would need to be mobilized in a more strategic and more forward-looking kind of way, so that you, to the extent possible, contain the impulse where it hits. If once you move to the sectoral level and try to design local shock absorbers, you of course have to understand a lot about the specificities of these sectors, which is why I think what we really need is an assessment of what these shock absorbers could look like, what monitoring mechanisms could look like for the various sectors. What we would be doing for oil and gas would not be the same as what we would be doing for, let's say, transportation. Price policies, then, from my perspective, are a means of last resort that can be used to contain shocks if you do not have any actual shock absorbers that can correct the shortfall of supply. But just as John Kenneth Galbraith would have suggested, whom I consider the most important theorist of price controls of the 20th century in the United States, price controls or price policies or any kind of price stabilization mechanisms, and I'm quite consciously using a range of words here because I think we have to move away from the idea that price policy is simply putting, like kind of, if you think of the demand supply curve, putting a horizontal line into such a simplistic diagram, but that there can be a wide variety of policy designs that can achieve greater price stability. But whatever you do in terms of price policies, they will always only buy time, but time can be of the essence because it can create a situation where supply corrections can occur without having the propagation and conflict stage follow. Now, if you are buying time, of course, it will depend on how you use that time. And that will be the critical variable. Windfall profit taxes can be some sort of a second layer of disincentivizing profit margin, increasing kind of pricing behavior. However, as I've tried to point out, reacting to a cost shock by keeping profit margins constant already results in a redistribution and already turns a local price shock into generalized inflation. So therefore, windfall profit taxes can only be a complementary tool to disincentivize the most extreme kind of pricing behavior, but not to contain the general kind of dynamic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Weber. I think we'll take one question from the floor before we move into the next part where you will also attend. So let me see, I have a gentleman here on the back row. Do we have a microphone? It's being passed through the row. It's coming, it's coming. Oh, can someone help me out? Oh, it's taking too long. But it is progressing. Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and convincing presentation. It confirms a theory that I've had that actually we had too much inflation because local retailers, both shops and restaurants and so on, after a very long period of price stability, they had creeping increase in some costs. And now they saw the opportunity to raise the price. And they didn't know if they were going to have a second opportunity to do so. So they actually increased the price of a lunch in Stockholm or paper at a office goods shop much more than they would have otherwise. I wonder if you would agree with that there was an overinflation because of this long period of stability, and now they could make an increase.
Thank you very much for your question. Professor Weber, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so thank you for bringing in the long period of stability. And I think indeed the puzzle is, why is it the case that we have had incredibly concentrated kind of corporate structures before the pandemic, and these same corporate structures have kept prices surprisingly stable, and now in the context of these emergencies, these same very large firms, or at least like price-making firms, are suddenly starting to hike prices. And I think that the word opportunity is the key word here, in the sense that if these firms had started to increase prices before the pandemic, they would have harmed themselves. They would have lost market shares. They would have lost competitors. But once you have these cost shocks basically served as a coordinating mechanism that made it safe to increase prices, so that you had to be less afraid of your competitors. But we have also seen what some folks over at Bloomberg have been labeling excuseflation, which basically suggests that when you see every day on the news that there has been a gigantic mess up in the grain trade, or that there have been gigantic price spikes in oil and gas, and then you go to the shop and you buy whatever you're buying, your expectation as a customer that prices will be going up has changed compared to what happened before. So both from the perspective of market share in relationship to other firms, in relationship to competitors, as well as from the perspective of demand, there is an opportunity of increasing prices that did not present itself before. And in fact, this reasoning is one that I haven't thought out in isolation, but that I have discerned by reading a pretty large number of earnings calls where basically corporate leaders are explaining exactly that kind of logic. And you might just turn on CNBC or one of these business channels and listen to CEOs report on their earnings. I mean, go back to 2021, 2022, and you will find that kind of reasoning.
Thank you very much, Professor Weber. And please hang on for the next part.